The first time Olivia saw the house, it looked more abandoned than lived in. She had been driving through a quiet back road in northern Maine, the kind of place where the trees grow so thick they feel like a wall pressing in on both sides. Her phone had lost service miles back, and the GPS had given up before that. It was late in the afternoon, with a pale sun fighting through heavy gray clouds, and she had pulled over to stretch her legs. The house sat at the end of a narrow gravel path, half hidden by overgrown weeds. Its wooden siding had faded to a sickly gray, the windows either dark or shuttered, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle like a tired old man. Yet, despite its condition, something about it seemed watchful, as if it knew she had stopped to look at it. She told herself it was just curiosity that made her walk closer. Maybe it had once been a boarding house or a family's summer retreat left to rot in the woods. She noted how silent everything was. No birds, no breeze, not even the hum of distant traffic. The quiet pressed into her ears until she could hear the faint crunch of her own shoes on the gravel. A shiver ran up her spine, though the air wasn't particularly cold. When she reached the front gate, a rusted iron arch nearly swallowed by vines, she stopped. The gate was open, hanging loosely on its hinges, and beyond it the path wound up to a porch that sagged under the weight of moss. She hadn't meant to come this far, but there she was, staring up at the house as if waiting for it to notice her that a sound came from inside. It was faint, muffled, but unmistakable, a soft creak like footsteps on an old staircase. Olivia froze. It was impossible, she thought. No one could be living here. But the sound came again, a groan of wood under shifting weight. She peered through the shadowy windows, but saw nothing except the warped reflection of herself standing in the fading light. A logical voice in her head whispered, an animal, maybe, a raccoon or a fox. Yet her chest tightened, and she felt the prickle of being watched from behind the glass. She pulled her jacket tighter and glanced back at her car, half hidden by the curve of the road. Going back suddenly seemed very wise, but the strangest thing happened when she turned to leave. From the corner of her eye, she saw the front door move. Just slightly, enough that she knew it hadn't been the wind. The door had opened an inch, the darkness inside yawning wider. Her pulse skipped, and her throat went dry. She didn't move, didn't breathe, until the door eased back into place as though nothing had disturbed it at all. Olivia stood there, gripping the straps of her bag, trying to decide if she had imagined the entire thing. But when she glanced down at the gate again, her heart stuttered. The iron gate, which had been sagging open when she arrived, was now shut. She backed away slowly, refusing to turn her back on the house. Step by step, she made her way to her car, fumbling for her keys with trembling fingers. Her eyes never left the porch, the dark windows, the silent door. By the time she got behind the wheel and locked it, her breathing had quickened into short, sharp gasps. The house sat in the dimming light, unchanged, silent, as if mocking her fear. She told herself again and again that she had only imagined the movement, the sound, the gate. But when she finally drove off, gravel spitting from her tires, she couldn't shake the image of the house watching her retreat. And even stranger, she swore she saw the faint flicker of a light come on in an upstairs window as she rounded the bend and lost sight of it. The morning after the dream, Megan woke with the uneasy sensation that her room was smaller than it had been before, the walls just a fraction closer. Her porthole window, usually streaked with spray, was perfectly clean, so clean it reflected her face like a mirror. When she looked into it, for the briefest second, she thought she saw someone standing directly behind her. She spun around, but the cabin was empty. Her unease grew heavier by the hour. She couldn't shake the man's words from the previous day, "You're in my cabin." Determined to learn the truth, she sought out Helen in the library. The older woman's knitting needles clicked rapidly as Megan asked if she knew anything about Cabin 743. Helen hesitated before lowering her voice. "There are stories," she said. "A man died in that room. Some say he jumped from the deck. Others say he never left at all." Megan pressed her for details, but Helen only shook her head. "The crew won't talk about it. Not officially. They scrub the passenger lists every year, but sometimes things slip through." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "I kept this from a cruise years ago. Same ship. Look at the names." When Megan unfolded the paper, Her stomach tightened. It was a photocopy of an old passenger list, dated exactly 3 years prior. Most of the names were blurred from the copy, but one stood out in sharp, bold print. Daniel Crow, cabin 743. In the column marked disembarked, his entry was blank. Megan ran her finger down the list twice, hoping she'd missed it, but there was no departure record. When she looked up, Helen's eyes were glassy. He never checked out, Helen whispered. And neither did the girl who had that room before you. That night, as the ship rocked gently on the dark water, an announcement blared over the intercom, the kind that instantly quieted every conversation on board. Attention all passengers. If anyone has seen Ms. Laura Bennett, please contact guest services immediately. Murmurs swept through the hallways. Megan didn't know the name, but her chest tightened anyway. Later, she overheard two crew members whispering near the stairwell. She was last seen near the aft deck, one said. Security says the cameras glitched again. The other just muttered, "It's happening again." Before walking off quickly, in the early hours of the morning, Megan awoke to the sensation of the mattress shifting, as if someone had just sat down beside her. She kept her eyes closed, paralyzed, every muscle rigid. A moment later, a cold fingertip brushed her wrist, and a man's voice whispered near her ear, "You need to leave." For the next 2 nights, Hannah tried to convince herself she was imagining everything. Stress, sleep deprivation, the breakup still gnawing at her nerves. But the apartment refused to let her forget. The whispering became more insistent, no longer confined to the corner of her bedroom. Sometimes it seemed to slip through the walls as she washed dishes or folded clothes, as though the voices were following her from room to room. Once, when she pressed her ear against the wallpaper in the hallway, she swore she heard breathing, slow, steady, inches from her head. She jerked away so fast she nearly tripped over the rug, her stomach clenching with dread. By the fourth night, a new detail emerged. As she lay in bed, trying to block out the whispers, she heard something else, an abrasive sound, faint at first but steadily sharpening. A scraping, a dragging. It came from inside the wall behind her bed frame, like nails clawing through plaster. She sat up, paralyzed, as the sound moved closer, then stopped abruptly, leaving silence so complete it rang in her ears. Summoning every ounce of courage, she leaned forward and pressed her palm against the wall. The plaster was warm. Morning light made the experience feel less sinister, but when Hannah pulled her bed away from the wall, her breath caught in her throat. The wallpaper there was torn, and beneath it were long, vertical gouges etched into the plaster. They looked too deep, too deliberate, as if carved by human hands. She traced them with trembling fingers, noticing the faint smears of something dark clinging to the grooves. Dried rust, she told herself. Old stains. But the word blood pressed into her mind, heavy and undeniable. Shaken, she called the landlord again, demanding answers. He sighed, impatient, and told her it was an old building with quirks. When she pressed further, mentioning the scratches, his tone changed, quieter, sharper. "Don't go peeling the walls," he snapped. "You'll regret it." Then he hung up. His reaction rattled her almost as much as the scratches themselves. Why such hostility over a simple question? What did he know that he wasn't saying? That evening, Hannah sat in the living room with every light turned on, her laptop open to the missing man's article. She enlarged his photo until the pixels blurred, staring into the familiar face. That scar, those tired eyes, it was more than recognition. It was déjà vu, nagging at her from the edges of memory. And then, as if on cue, the whispers rose again from her bedroom. Not one voice. Two. Overlapping, urgent. She forced herself to listen, her whole body rigid. Beneath the static murmur, she caught words strung together like threads in a fraying rope. "Help me." Sleep was no longer an option. Hannah's nights had become long vigils, spent waiting for the voices to begin. Even when she finally drifted into uneasy dreams, she woke drenched in sweat, her mind echoing with fragments of whispers she couldn't forget. The scratches on the wall gnawed at her, daring her to pull more wallpaper aside. But something in her gut told her not to, not yet. Instead, she resolved to learn more about the building itself. If someone had vanished here, if the last tenant left without warning, there had to be more stories. Secrets like this didn't hide forever. She started with the public library. The building was old enough to appear in city records, and she spent the afternoon flipping through brittle newspapers and yellowed maps. Buried among mundane reports of renovations and zoning disputes, she found a thin column from the late 1970s. The headline read, "Tenant dies in mysterious fall." A man had been found in the stairwell, neck broken, though neighbors insisted they'd heard no struggle. The article quoted a widow from the third floor who claimed she had heard voices in the walls the night before the accident. The details sent a chill crawling down Hannah's spine. This wasn't new. It had been happening for decades. Later that evening, she returned to the apartment with a pounding headache and a growing sense of dread. The elevator was out of order again, forcing her to take the stairs. As she passed the basement door, she noticed it had been left ajar, the padlock dangling loose as if someone had pried it open. Curiosity overrode fear. She descended the narrow steps into a space that smelled of dust, mildew, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. The basement was filled with old furniture and discarded boxes, a graveyard of forgotten lives. Near the far wall, a cabinet stood slightly open, its drawers stuffed with brittle paper folders. Inside were old tenant files. Most were mundane, rental applications, payment receipts, but as she sifted through them, Hannah noticed a pattern. Several folders ended abruptly, with tenants marked as moved out, but with no forwarding address, no deposit returned. A few were crossed out in red ink, their names scrawled over so violently the paper tore. Her stomach twisted when she found the file for the man in the article, the one who had disappeared 2 years ago. His paperwork ended mid-page, the handwriting rushed, as though someone had interrupted while filling it out. A faint brown smear stained the corner of the page, brittle and flaking under her fingertips. The sound of footsteps froze her where she stood. They were slow, deliberate, descending the basement stairs one by one. Hannah's breath caught as the cabinet door creaked open wider, as if nudged by an unseen hand. She crouched behind a stack of boxes, pulse hammering in her ears. The footsteps stopped halfway down the stairs, lingering. Silence pressed in, broken only by the faint rattle of the pipes above. Then came a whisper, stretched thin but clear enough to chill her marrow. "We know you're here." Hannah's lungs burned as she crouched behind the boxes, every instinct screaming at her to run. The footsteps on the stairs had stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse. She forced herself not to move, barely daring to breathe. Her eyes locked on the open cabinet, on the yellowed tenant files spilling out like dead leaves. One paper flapped slightly as though stirred by a draft, but there was no draft. The basement air was still, heavy, suffocating. Her fingers curled into her palms hard enough to sting. Then came the sound again. Not footsteps this time, but the scrape of something dragging across the cement floor. It was slow, deliberate, drawing closer from the stairwell's shadows. Hannah clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her ears strained to separate the noises, the faint rattle of pipes above, the hum of the building, the soft scrape edging nearer. Then words, barely audible, but carried clearly in the stale basement air. "You shouldn't have looked." The voice was low, almost guttural, and unmistakably inside the room with her. She bolted. The sound of her own heartbeat drowned out everything else as she scrambled to her feet and sprinted toward the stairs. She risked a glance over her shoulder and froze. Just beyond the cabinet, in the deepest pocket of shadow, something moved. It wasn't solid, not exactly. More like a distortion in the dark, an outline bending the space around it. She couldn't make out features, only the impression of height, of something watching. It didn't chase her. It didn't need to. Its stillness was worse, patient and certain, as though it already knew she would come back. By the time Hannah reached her apartment door, her hands were shaking so violently she fumbled the keys twice before getting inside. She slammed the door shut, shoved the chain across, and pressed her back against the wood. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her mind replaying the image of that shadow again and again. She told herself it was a trick of the light, stress, sleep deprivation. But deep down, she knew better. The whispers weren't hallucinations. The scratches weren't accidents. Something was inside the building, inside the walls, and it had noticed her. That night, she didn't try to sleep. She sat in the living room with every light on, her laptop open, the article about the missing tenant glowing on the screen. She hovered her cursor over his photo, staring into the scarred face. For the first time, she realized why he seemed familiar. She had seen him in her dreams. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times over the years. Always in nightmares she never fully remembered upon waking. Her stomach twisted as the radiator in her bedroom hissed suddenly, loudly, like it was exhaling. And then, from the corner of the room, a whisper surfaced, softer than breath. "He dreams of you too." The whisper clung to Hannah long after it faded, wrapping around her like a second skin. "He dreams of you too." She sat frozen in the glow of her laptop screen, her thoughts spinning. It was impossible. She had never met the missing tenant, never even lived in this city when he disappeared. And yet, his face had haunted her subconscious for years. Dreams of dim hallways, of closed doors and faceless shadows, always ending with a man standing at the edge of her vision. Sometimes he reached for her. Sometimes he whispered things she could never remember after waking. Her skin crawled at the thought that maybe those weren't just dreams. Maybe they were memories of something else. Determined to shake the thought, she dug deeper online. The article about his disappearance was short, but she found a forum thread where neighbors had speculated about what happened. One user claimed the man had complained about hearing people talking through the vents. Another wrote that he had been obsessed with finding a way into the walls, convinced someone was hiding behind them. Hannah scrolled until her eyes blurred, until she found a photo another user had posted, a grainy snapshot of the man standing outside the building. She zoomed in, her heart stuttering. Behind him, in a darkened window of the building, something faintly human-shaped loomed in the reflection. That night, the whispers began earlier than usual, around midnight. Hannah sat rigid on the couch, every light blazing, clutching her phone like a lifeline. At first, the voices overlapped in their usual murmur, indecipherable. But then one cut through, sharper than the rest. "Look closer." The lamp nearest her flickered, buzzing angrily before steadying. Heart pounding, Hannah turned toward the radiator. The dark corner seemed to ripple. For the briefest second, she thought she saw the man from the photograph standing there, his features blurred, as though water warped his face. His eyes, however, were clear, locked on hers with unbearable intensity. She screamed, stumbling backward into the kitchen, knocking over a chair. But when she turned again, the corner was empty. Only shadows remained, dense and unmoving. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body shaking as she pressed her back to the refrigerator. She wanted to run, to leave the building entirely, but when she grabbed her keys, her hand froze on the knob. From the other side of the door came the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate, stopping right outside her apartment. The chain rattled gently, as though tested. Hannah dropped her keys, the metallic clatter echoing in the silence. The footsteps didn't retreat. They just waited. Minutes stretched into hours, or so it felt, until she finally slumped against the counter, too drained to move. When she opened her eyes again, dawn light was filtering through the windows. The hallway outside was quiet, but a piece of folded paper had been slid under her door. With trembling hands, she unfolded it. In neat block letters, scrawled in fading black ink, were 3 words, "You know me." Hannah stared at the note until the ink blurred. "You know me." The words felt like an accusation, a taunt, a truth she had buried somewhere deep inside herself. She tried to tell herself it was a prank, some sick joke from a neighbor, but no one in the building had shown any interest in her except the sharp-eyed woman in the hallway, and that woman had barely spoken a full sentence. Besides, the handwriting looked aged, faded, as though the ink had been sitting for years. She dropped the paper on the counter as though it burned. Exhaustion gnawed at her resolve, but she forced herself to act. She couldn't sit and wait anymore. If the apartment was connected to the man's disappearance, if the whispers were tied to him, there had to be more hidden in its bones. She remembered the gouges behind her bed, the way the plaster had peeled like scabs. That night, armed with a box cutter and a flashlight, she pushed the bed aside again and began slicing away at the wallpaper. The blade cut easily, curling strips of faded paper from the wall. Beneath it, more scratches appeared, dozens of them, layered like frantic messages scrawled by unseen hands. Some scratches looked almost like words. Not full sentences, but jagged letters pressed deep into plaster. "Stay. Don't. Mine." Her heart hammered as she traced them with trembling fingers. Between the gouges, She found what looked like handprints, smeared into the wall itself, as if someone had tried to push through from the other side. She stumbled back, while rising in her throat. It wasn't just damage, it was evidence of struggle, of someone desperate to get out. The air grew heavier the longer she stared, her flashlight flickering though the batteries were new. And then, without warning, the whispering surged, no longer faint but deafening. It came from everywhere at once. The radiator, the closet, the very walls around her. She dropped the flashlight as voices overlapped, hundreds of them, some weeping, some screaming, some chanting words she couldn't understand. But threading through them all was his voice, the missing man. She knew it as surely as she knew her own heartbeat. "You remember me," it said, clear, close, undeniable. Hannah clamped her hands over her ears, but the words vibrated inside her skull, rattling her bones. When the cacophony finally subsided, the silence felt worse. The air reeked faintly of rust and damp soil. She turned to grab her fallen flashlight, but froze. The scratches on the wall had changed. Where before there were fragmented letters and claw marks, now there was a single phrase etched deep into the plaster, fresh as if carved that instant. "Welcome back." Hannah didn't remember falling asleep. One moment she was staring at the words gouged into the plaster, "Welcome back," and the next she was standing barefoot in the hallway outside her apartment. The walls were darker than usual, their wallpaper pulsing faintly, as though veins ran beneath the plaster. The sconces overhead flickered, throwing shadows that writhed like living things. A strange certainty filled her. This wasn't the waking world. She was trapped inside the same dream that had followed her for years, the one where he always waited. She walked, though her legs felt heavy, her steps echoing unnaturally loud against the wooden floor. Each door she passed seemed to lean toward her, their peepholes glinting like eyes. Somewhere up ahead, she heard breathing, not her own, but slow and ragged, as though someone were dragging air through ruined lungs. She turned a corner and froze. At the far end of the corridor stood the man from the photograph, the missing tenant. His face was clearer here than it had ever been in waking life. Dark hair, tired eyes, that thin scar along his jaw. But his expression wasn't one of recognition, it was hunger. "You came back," he rasped, though his lips barely moved. The words didn't sound like they came from him at all, but from the walls themselves, vibrating through the wood and plaster. Hannah stumbled back, shaking her head. "I don't know you," she whispered. But the man only tilted his head, smiling faintly. "You do. You've always known me. You just forgot." His eyes locked onto hers, and in that instant, memories surged up unbidden, snatches of dreams from years ago. A darkened room. A hand pressed against hers through the wall. A voice whispering her name as she slept in childhood. The hallway seemed to constrict around her, the doors warping, stretching taller, thinner, their frames bending like softened wax. She ran, her breath tearing out of her throat, but no matter how far she went, the man's voice followed. "You belong here. You always did." She slammed against her own apartment door, shoving it open. Inside, the space wasn't hers anymore. The furniture was different, older, dust-covered, belonging to another era. And there, sitting in the corner by the radiator, was the man again, waiting. His shadow stretched unnaturally across the room, long enough to touch her feet that Hannah's scream ripped her awake. She was back in her own bed, drenched in sweat, her throat raw. For a moment, she clung to the hope it had only been a nightmare. But when she sat up, her stomach dropped. On the floor by the radiator, faint and wet as if freshly drawn, was a handprint. A man's handprint. And smeared just above it, written in the same rusty streak, were two words that stole the air from her lungs. Not dream. The words on the wall, not dream, were the final fracture in Hannah's fragile denial. Whatever was happening wasn't confined to her imagination. The apartment was bleeding into her, or she into it. She spent the day pacing, chewing the inside of her cheek raw, her body aching with exhaustion. She couldn't stop replaying his face in her mind. The scar, the tired eyes, the way he had looked at her with a familiarity that bordered on ownership. She needed answers, and there was only one place left to turn. The sharp-eyed woman down the hall. When the woman finally answered the door, Hannah all but collapsed into the threshold, blurting everything. The whispers, the scratches, the man in her dreams. For a long time the neighbors said nothing, just studied her with pitying eyes. Finally, she sighed and gestured for Hannah to come inside. The apartment was dim, heavy with incense and old photographs. "You should have never come here," the woman said. "The building remembers. It keeps what it wants." Hannah pressed, desperate. What did it want with her? Why the man? The neighbor hesitated before answering. "He lived here too long. He fed it. Now he's part of it. And you?" She trailed off, her gaze sharpening. "You've touched it before. That's why it knows you." The words made no sense at first, until fragments of memory clawed up from the depths of Hannah's mind. She was young, 6, maybe 7, visiting her aunt in the very same building. She remembered the radiator in the guest room, how it hissed like a living thing. She remembered pressing her hand against the wall one night and feeling another hand press back. She had told herself it was a dream, a child's fantasy. But it wasn't. She had made contact. And the building hadn't forgotten. The neighbor gripped Hannah's hands, her voice urgent now. "You must leave before it's too late. But understand this, he won't let you. Once the walls mark you, you're theirs." Her words sank into Hannah's chest like lead. She thought of the scratches spelling welcome back, of the handprint by the radiator, of the voice that had whispered, "You know me." She realized then that leaving wouldn't be simple. It wasn't just the apartment that had claimed her. It was him. The missing man wasn't gone. He had become something else. And he had been waiting for her return all along. That night, Hannah packed a bag in frantic silence. She could hear the whispers pacing the walls, agitated, restless, as though aware of her intent. When she tried the front door, the chain refused to slide, no matter how she pulled. The lock turned uselessly in her hand, the metal groaning like bone under strain. From the corner of the room, the radiator hissed, louder and louder, until it drowned out her panicked breaths. Then came the voice, his voice, filling the apartment with terrible certainty. "You can't leave me again." Hannah's hands trembled as she clawed at the lock, but the door would not yield. The chain clung like iron fused to the frame, immovable. The whispers pressed closer, crowding the apartment until the air itself seemed to vibrate. She staggered back, clutching her packed bag like a shield. The lights flickered, dimmed, and went out, plunging her into darkness broken only by the dull glow of the radiator. The hiss deepened into a guttural breath, like lungs expanding after years underwater. She realized then that she had never been alone in the apartment, not for a single moment. The voice returned, low and steady. "You're home now." She turned toward the corner, where shadows coiled like smoke. Slowly, the figure of the missing man emerged. He looked almost human, but wrong. The edges of his body blurred, as though he were half-formed, stitched from shadow and plaster. His eyes gleamed in the dark, reflecting faint light, and his scarred mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You left me once," he rasped, stepping closer. "You don't get to leave again." Hannah's chest heaved as she backed against the wall. Memories she had long buried surged into clarity. The hand on the other side of the radiator when she was a child, the whispered promises in her dreams, the sense of belonging that had always frightened her but never let go. She understood now. She hadn't stumbled into his world by accident. She had been marked years ago, chosen, bound to this place. He wasn't haunting her. He was claiming her. And the building was his body, his prison, and now, her own. The walls shuddered as he reached out a hand, impossibly long, impossibly dark. Hannah thought to scream, to resist, but her body betrayed her. The whispers didn't sound frightening anymore. They sounded familiar, like a lullaby half-remembered from childhood. She felt her hand rising on its own, meeting his. When their palms touched, the air split open with a sound like tearing fabric. The room buckled, folding in on itself, and for one dizzying instant Hannah saw countless faces pressing out of the walls, past tenants, all of them staring, all of them whispering, "By dawn." The apartment was silent again. The neighbor down the hall swore she heard nothing unusual, though she noticed Hannah's door was ajar. Inside, the unit looked as though it had been abandoned overnight. Half-unpacked boxes, clothes strewn across the floor, a cold cup of coffee on the counter. The only sign of Hannah was on the bedroom wall, a fresh handprint, pressed deep into the plaster beside the radiator. Her file was quietly added to the cabinet in the basement, marked with the same 2 words as all the others before hers: "Moved out."